It's now my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, John Piotti. Don't turn it on yet. Or at least come behind me. I won't read John's biography. You can read it in the program, but I will tell you that I first came to understand who John was and what he'd done when I had the opportunity to hire one of his former employees from the Maine Farmland Trust. That was Stacy, who was looking to make a change. And as soon as I learned that she had worked for the Maine Farmland Trust, I was very eager to bring her on the staff. And now we know that that eagerness was justified, because the Maine Farmland Trust, under John's direction, from my perspective, became known as an innovator and a pioneer in farmland conservation. And I was very eager to capture some of that experience and wisdom and bring it here to the Monadnock region. And now John, of course, gets to share that with the entire country as president of the American Farmland Trust. And we're so grateful that he could be here with us today. Come on.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's nice to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, good. Steve mentioned today that I came from Washington to talk to you. That's always a scary line. But in this case, it's not even true. I actually came from Sunapee this morning and drove down. My wife's great-grandfather built a little cottage on Great Island in Lake Sunapee in 1902. And it's had about 114 years worth of deferred maintenance since then. But we plug away at a project here and there, and we enjoy it very much. My wife's family is from Vermont, and we've been living in Maine for ages, which is where my family is rooted. And so we drive through New Hampshire a lot, usually on a more northerly route than this, a lot of time on Route 4. I really wish we were driving through this part of the state instead. This is a real treasure that you have here. And I'm so pleased that there's an organization like the Monadnock Conservancy keeping some of these treasures of this landscape alive. It's great. It's wonderful. And I think a lot of us who care about conservation, we want to see things sort of continue to look the same, and we want to make sure that wildlife flourishes, and we want to make sure that there's clear and clean air to breathe. But it's also important, for a host of reasons, for us to think about working lands. And that's really the focus of what I've been asked to talk about. I've spent a lot of my career focused on farming. And I was asked to speak about the future of farming in a place like New England, which, when I got into this business 25 years ago, everyone assumed that farming in the Northeast was a relic, a thing of the past, dead in modern terms. And there has been quite a renaissance in agriculture, and I want to talk about that and talk a little bit about why it's happened, some of the fundamentals. And it could be, I entitled this, Local Food and Farming's Renaissance. The subtitle could be, and the critical role that conservation plays in that. Because, and I'll get into it in my talk, the current economic forces alone are not going to be enough to get new farmers on the land. We really need a switch in some ways. Is this echoing for everybody? It's certainly echoing for me. I'm wondering if turning that off.
I'm going to turn you down a little bit. Give that a try.
Is that better? Yeah, it was disconcerting for me. I can't imagine what it sounds like for all of you. So that's my point, that conservation has a real critical role to play if we're going to realize the vision for farming in New England, which a lot of us think is possible. So let me just start with a few facts and figures, and I'm going to use Maine figures because that's what I know, and I apologize for that. But so here's what's happened with agriculture in the state of Maine. In 2012, the number of farms had gone up in the previous 10 years by a whopping 13.5%. Now, if this had happened in any other economic sector, everyone and their brother would be jumping up and down saying, this is the greatest thing in the world. But for some reason, because it's farming, people immediately sort of look for excuses or reasons. Oh, those are hobby farms. Those don't count. Or well, yeah, but it's really small scale. Well, the truth is some of those farms are small scale, but they're still working the land. They're still keeping it open. They're still producing food. They're still providing a myriad of benefits to the community. But the other key point is, in Maine anyway, the vast majority of these farms are real. They are commercial operations, usually infused with young energy, and that are doing some amazing things. Not too different from some of the examples that Ryan showed that you all know that are happening right here. So a couple of pieces of information. 48% of farms list farming as their primary occupation. That doesn't sound like a lot, don't you know? It's only half. Well, that's up in a 5-year period from 43%. So that's my point. The growth is very much in real farms doing real work. But here's the kicker. The national average for farms through which over half of their income comes from farming operation is only 47%. We have this myth in our mind that, well, it's not real here in New England, but it's real in Indiana. If you look at the percentage in Indiana of how many farms bring their principal income from farming operations, it is less than New England. So the truth is we have to change our mindset about farming. Farming is often a companion business to doing other things, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's still real. It's still farming. A few other statistics about farming. 29% of farmers are women. That's a huge area of growth. In Maine, that's up from 25% in 2007. Huge percentage change in a relatively small period of time. Farmers are generally quite old. Stacy sent me some information saying the average age of farmers in your area is 56. That's about average for New England. The organization I now work for, American Farmland Trust, has just released a whole series of research papers on the age of farmers and their transition plans. In the bottom line, with so many farmers, again, statistics for Maine, but 60% of our farmers are going to be of retirement age or well past within 10 years. And most of those farmers don't know what they're going to do with their property. This is a huge issue. In Maine alone, we estimate that 400,000 acres of farmland will be in transition in the next 5 to 10 years due simply to demographic factors, let alone if the price of milk goes even lower and we lose more dairy farms, what's going to happen. So this is significant, and the time to address this is now. The flip side of this is the encouraging piece, and that's young farmers are growing. Again, statistics from Maine, you can't brag about this in New Hampshire. The number of young farmers that we saw between the 2007 and the 2012 census. By the way, you might be wondering, all these numbers, they end in 7s, they end in 2. The Department of Agriculture does an agricultural census every 5 years, and that just happens to be when they do them. So the number of farmers of these ages skyrocketed. We were the highest increase of any state in the country. We're very proud of that. And you know, percentages don't necessarily mean a lot. If you're going from 1 to 2, that's a 100% increase. Doesn't mean much. But we're talking here about going from about 300 farmers that fit this description to somewhere in the 500 range. It's significant. This is really happening. And it's been touted across the country, what we've been able to do in Maine. And I can tell you that although we've been at it for a while and we've been doing some impressive things, the underlying fundamentals that are driving young farmers to Maine are no different from the underlying fundamentals that you can be taking advantage of here in southwestern New Hampshire. So a couple of other things. It's easy to talk about all of this, but I want to take a step back and just talk a little bit about agriculture more broadly, because as a society, we've become a couple of generations removed from the farm. We don't necessarily understand agriculture the way our grandparents did. So here's my summary of agriculture in New England. And any summary by definition is wrong, right? You know, it doesn't get into the nuances and the details, but it's a useful way of thinking about what's happening. So envision agriculture as having two tracks. On the one track is what a lot of us customarily think of as a farm. Maybe it was embedded from reading storybooks as kids or whatever. It would be a farm with silos and big equipment out front and tractors going back and forth and stuff like that. And they're producing product, and those products are going to wholesalers or going to processors and then going into our food system. That's commodity scale operations where the farmers are doing their work and the product just sort of disappears and goes off somewhere else. And in New England, we used to have a lot of commodity production in dairy, in Maine, in potatoes, in orchards, huge across this region and others. And I can go on and on down that list. Today, in New England, commodity production is a small fraction of what it was 50 years ago, which was a small fraction of what it was 100 years ago. The trend has been down. And in New England now, with the exception of Maine, the only commodity production is really only in dairy, which, as we all know, is struggling for a host of reasons that I might talk about later. It's dangerous to get me talking about dairy. I can go on for hours about milk prices. But other than Maine, where we still have a fairly significant potato crop in far northern Maine, the only real commodity production, other than cranberries, in New England is dairy. That's one track, commodity production. The other track has gone by different names over the years, but the term that's usually applied now is local agriculture. And it could be farms that are raising a variety of things. They could be raising potatoes, they could be raising milk. What distinguishes them and puts them from the commodity track into the local ag track is not so much their product, but how they market. And in local ag, what they're doing is they're marketing what we call direct or close to direct. So direct would be the farm stand or being a CSA member. Close to direct would be a relationship with a local food store or some local restaurants. But something where the value and the identity of that product retains throughout the value chain. So you go into that store and you know, oh, I'm getting this from the local farm. And that's really been an effort, in essence, to go around the middleman and sell in a manner that has more of the value flow back to the farmer. And if I were to summarize what's happened in New England agriculture in the last 20 years, with a decline in commodity production, it is that this local ag has, in some cases, kept alive farms, and in other cases, allowed new farms to thrive. In all of the statistics that we've seen of agriculture growing in New England has been almost exclusively in this local ag area. So now that you have my summary of what's happened, it's easy to jump to a conclusion. Commodity ag, big, old, dying, local ag, new, exciting, dynamic, growing. This is the past, this is the future. That's wrong. At least I think that's wrong. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know for sure. But when I think of the strength of agriculture in New England, I actually think the strength is that we can operate at many scales and be very diversified in not only our products, but the nature of the farms, the nature of the marketing systems. Because the truth is, if we're serious about having more people eat the food that's grown close to home, and there's great reasons for that, quality, freshness, health, environmental opportunities of having more working lands rather than dollar stores on our best land. There's all those benefits, the multiplier effect in the local economy, the environmental footprint that's so much smaller if you're getting your food close to home. Great reasons why it would be wonderful to see us growing more of our own food. But the truth is, although farm stands and CSAs continue to grow, and I think that's absolutely wonderful, and I've spent a lot of my career getting those things started, the vast majority of consumers are never going to get their food by being a CSA member or visiting a farm stand or a farmer's market. If we're serious about having more local food in the hands, in the mouths of local consumers, we need to think about how you get food more easily into supermarkets, into institutions like cafeterias and hospitals and the like. And all that relies on a little bit of scaling up to get some economies of scale and move product at slightly higher levels. So as I said, no one has a crystal ball, but a lot of us who have been working on this for a long time think the next wave of agriculture in places like New England is developing some of the infrastructure that we used to have. We used to have a very robust local and regional infrastructure system. Many New England towns had the corn shop where you did some processing. And there were a lot of slaughterhouses and other facilities here and there. A lot of that has been lost. Don't get the wrong idea. We have a very efficient food system, but it moves product at the global scale. We don't really have the infrastructure that we used to have or that we could have again to move product locally and regionally in efficient ways. So a lot of us feel the next wave is a little bit of scaling up in the best sense of that word, not to commoditize the products that are here, not to lose the quality and freshness or the fact that more of the benefits can flow back to the farmer rather than the middleman. But scale up enough so you get some economies of scale and you can get into some of these markets and you can do some processing. It's a combination of sort of infrastructure and, as we'll talk about in a bit, having the land and utilizing that land wisely. So that's the story of what's happened in agriculture. I've already mentioned that things are growing. I want to now make the point that we're really actually poised well for future growth. And the reason is because the fundamentals are good. We really have some advantages over other places. I'm going to run through those quickly. The first one is that we have plenty of land, and you might say, wow, we're populated. This isn't like Nebraska where there's nobody and there's just open land. But we have a lot more good land than we get credit for. Now again, I'm going to rely on Maine statistics because I know them well. But Maine has 1 million acres of soil that is either prime or of statewide significance. 1 million acres. You can grow all of the fruits and all of the vegetables consumed by all of New England on 1 million acres. We don't have nearly that much under production, but we have that land. It's there. And the same is true in pockets across New England. The difference between us and Iowa is a 200-acre field isn't 200 acres of rich silt loam. There's 10 acres here that are good for one thing and 5 acres there that are suitable for nothing and something else that might work for pasture. But if you add it up, we actually have a lot more good land in New England than we get credit for. The story 150 years ago is we depleted the soils. And our ancestors walked away and went west and went somewhere where the soils were not yet depleted and where there seemed to be limitless opportunity. Well, for the last 150 years, they've been doing a bad job out west. And we have at this point in time, a far more level playing field than we generally think. So, plenty of land, water, in abundance. And who knows what's going to happen with the climate, but certainly all of the studies and estimates that I've seen suggest that if anything, it's going to be a little wetter in the Northeast. Now, it may all come in heavy rainstorms. We may need to be thinking about infrastructure for water retention and things like that. We are probably going to have more dry periods in the middle of the summer. That's another story. But the fundamental resource is still going to be here. It doesn't exist elsewhere. You just have to pick up the paper and read about the droughts in California or wherever. But what a lot of people don't know is that, in New England, we're used to the concept of a recharge aquifer. The aquifers that we have are basically aquifers that, between the rain and the snow that come in during the course of a year, the aquifers stay fairly level with the amount of water that's being drawn from them. There are other kind of aquifers too. There's something called a fossil aquifer. It was formed millions of years ago. It has a finite amount of water in it. There's a huge aquifer under the Plain States that is responsible, single aquifer, it covers a third of the West. It is responsible for over a third of all the irrigated food production in this country. By the best estimates, the water in that aquifer will be gone in 50 years. Gone. We've built an entire agricultural system around a source of water that is finite and will be over in the lifetime of many of the people in this room. Crazy, absolutely crazy. But here in the Northeast, we have water and we have it in abundance. All right, here's the one when people say, okay, John, you're absolutely crazy. I follow you on the water. Okay, maybe we have land, but good growing conditions up here in the frigid Northeast? What are you, crazy? Well, I want to stretch your minds a little bit. I want you to think about both your geography and your geometry. So I live in Maine from here, about 4.5 hours northeast. I have to travel another hour north of me to get to the town of Dover-Foxcroft in Maine. And why do I mention Dover-Foxcroft? Because it sits at the 45th parallel. So remember your geometry first, right? 45 is half of 90 degrees. 90 degrees is the North Pole. It's not nearly as bad as it seems, folks. Down here, you're way below halfway to the North Pole. There's a lot of the world up there. But seriously, take that line of latitude. Take 45 degrees, stretch it across the Atlantic. Where does it come out? Just north of Provence, France. The Po Valley in Italy. Very productive agricultural regions because it is not temperature, but sunlight, which is principally determined by latitude, that really determines what you can grow. Now, in Maine, we used to grow a lot of grain. Vermont used to grow a lot of grain as well. Probably some in New Hampshire, but not as much as Maine and Vermont. Back 150 years ago. In Maine, we've had a huge effort in the last 20 years to bring back grain production. And I can't tell you, when I've told people this, how often I've heard, grain in Maine? You can't grow grain in Maine. It's too damn cold. Do you know how much grain they grow in Saskatchewan? I mean, they call it winter wheat for a reason. You plant it in the late fall and it grows. But we have this mindset, and it's totally just in our heads, it's not based in science, that you can't grow things where it's cold. Now, granted, you can't grow tomatoes and eggplants in the middle of the winter outside of a heated greenhouse. But there's a whole bunch of other things which are the staples of our food economy, which can be grown in places like here. And I have a theory. Nobody's tested this yet. There's a budding PhD student in the crowd. Here's a possible thesis for you to test. The local food movement has been catching on everywhere now, but it really began in New England. Maine deserves some credit, Vermont deserves some credit, Western Massachusetts deserves some credit, but all of New England, it has taken off here faster, and I have a theory. And my theory is that New England, unlike most other parts of this country, still retains a serious notion of community. We have small towns where the local owner of the hardware store knows that I rely on that dairy farmer down the road for my existence. And so with connections like that, getting people to make purchasing decisions around local products begins to make a lot more sense. So we have good markets in New England just because of our mindset. But we also have good markets because there's a lot of people who live here. You know, this idea of you gotta grow food where there aren't people is stupid. The best place to grow food is right near people, because the market is there and the transportation costs are there and the fundamentals of the economics actually have the potential to be better. So we have stronger markets than we got given credit for. But nonetheless, you know, New England, it's not Iowa. So really the question before us is, okay, John, everything you hear you've been telling me sounds good, but can farming here really be something significant? Okay, you've been hearing my thoughts, and I've been espousing this stuff for 20 some odd years. Fortunately, some people who know a lot more than me and have a little bit of a higher credibility than I might, looked into this themselves. How many of you ever heard of the New England Food Vision? Does that ring a good? A few of you. This is a study that came out about 2 years ago. And what they did is they studied New England's ability to feed itself. And they looked at population trends, they looked at growth factors, they looked at dietary changes, they looked specifically at the land we had and what it was suitable for growing. It was a very detailed study. And here's the result, that New England could grow half to 2/3 of all of its own food in the next 30 years or so. It's going to take a while to ramp up. And by all of its food, I mean everything. I'm talking about grains, I'm talking about dairy, meat, eggs, all the fruits and vegetables, sweeteners, beverages, everything. The figure today is probably a little under 10%. So we're talking a quadrupling or more at the lowest levels here. Huge, huge impact on the economy if this could happen. Huge impact on our environment, positively, if it's done right, if this were to happen. But here's the kicker. To make this happen, New England's going to have 5 to 6 million acres of farmland in production. And today we have about 2. So it also requires a lot more farming. Now, where's this going to come from? Well, Maine's only part of the answer. It's a whole New England effort, but what I'm about to explain in Maine is not any different from the situation here in southwestern New Hampshire. In Maine in the 1880s, we farmed 6.5 million acres of land. 6.5 million acres. Now we farm 700,000. And the question is, where do those 5.8 million acres go? Now, some of it went to development, but not nearly as much as you might think. And maybe we're fortunate in Maine that nobody wants to live up where it's really cold. But maybe in Maine, 1 million of those acres have gone to development. But most of those acres haven't. Most of those acres have simply grown up in trees. And I'm not talking about plantation forests or great stands of woodland that fuel our forest products sector. I'm talking about the land, you guys all know it, the field that was there when I was a kid, and it's completely grown up in pasture pine or alder or something like that in the last 40 years. This stuff is all over New England. I was talking to Annie before this event, and she mentioned some statistics, and I'm going to maybe get the numbers wrong, but I think they're right because they're pretty consistent around all of New England except for the very farthest northern reaches of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. But across basically the rest of New England, it was 90% cleared 150 years ago. And now it's 90% either developed or woodland, and the vast majority is woodland. Now, I'm not saying we should rush out and cut down all those trees and turn them into farmland again. There's a good way to do it, there's a wrong way to do it. We made a lot of mistakes 200 years ago when we first cleared that land. Too close to rivers, on steep slopes that should have never supported agriculture any way, shape, or form. But there are ways to do it well. And if we're smart about it, I don't know what you guys, I won't get into too many details about. There's this concept called carbon farming, which is the idea of how much carbon you can sequester through good farming practices. But if you farm well, if you use cover crops, if you go in the direction of no-till agriculture, where you're not actually plowing up land, but using seed drills, if you get the right balance of crops, if you do a diversified operation rather than monocrops, if you do the correct rotation, your farmland can not only be producing great food that serves the local economy in a very powerful way and serves local eaters, you can sequester more carbon on that farm than you can in a forest. Absolutely. So farming, in my mind, this notion of farming, well, clearing land to farm, well, I like farms, but I don't necessarily like the idea of cutting down trees. The answer is far more nuanced than that. It all depends on how you do it, and there are ways to do it right. And if we could be eating more food that's grown within 50 or 100 miles of us, that has other clear major environmental benefits as well. So here's the line I've been telling my kids for years. What I just described is a vision, which I happen to like, and maybe it resonates with you as well, but just because something can happen doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? And in the case of the vision I just outlined for the future of agriculture in New England, there are some major challenges. You know, one of them is that farming here is hindered by a whole bunch of current realities, both economic realities and some demographic realities. For one thing, you can talk about growing a lot more food in that we have the land base to do it, and we have the climate to do it, and we have the water to do it. I mentioned we had strong markets, and we do. But if we, tomorrow, were growing and put another 1 million acres of New England farmland into cultivation, there would not be market for that food, here's the kicker, at price points that work for those farmers. There's always market for the food. Everyone wants local food, but they want local food that is often the same cost as factory-produced junk from wherever. Existing farmers who own the land usually have all of their equity tied up in it, and if they want to invest, if they are thinking of new equipment, if they are thinking of innovating in some manner to take advantage of new markets, where are they going to get their capital? They don't have any. But selling an easement is often a way to do that. When farmers sell an easement, it's very different from selling other things. When a farmer sells an easement, they invariably either use that money to invest in their farm operation, or they use that money to pay down their mortgage, which reduces their operating costs. And there's a check in this because the bank requires it. You're putting an easement on the property, so you're lowering the value, so the bank is not going to lend you as much, so you're going to have to use often some of that money to pay off some of that mortgage. So these guys aren't taking the money and running and buying yachts. They couldn't if they wanted to. They don't want to. They're doing this because they care about the land and they care about the future of farming. So anyway, a little bit of an aside there, but one of the realities that hinders this vision is this issue about land prices being based on development value. And an easement, well-structured agricultural easement, is a great tool that responds to this. And then I made this point earlier. The other issue is this: there's so much land that is going to be in transition in the very near future just because of all of those really old farmers. And I'm only talking about old farmers. There's an awful lot of really, really old land owners. Take dairy as a great example of this. You know, there's been shakeouts in dairy over the course of time, but there was a big one in the mid 1980s. And at that point in time, you know, Maine, again, I rely on Maine because I know it. Maine has had at that point in time about 1,500 dairy farms. It has about 300 today. It has the same number of cows, right? Because they were 50 cow dairies and now they're 200 cow dairies on average. I mean, and what happened is a guy had a farm and somebody else had to sell out, and that guy basically had purchased the cattle and put money in the infrastructure on his home farm and is doing a lot more. But the land base that supports that farm, he had to pick up all the fields of all those other farms, and he hardly ever bought it. It was leased land. It was a handshake lease in many instances. So that's land that often this farmer is terribly reliant on from an economic perspective, but he or she, but most dairy farmers are he, is totally reliant on it for the success of his farm, but he or she doesn't control it at all. That land is often owned by, to be stereotypical about it, you know, the widow of the guy who was farming it 35 years ago, who's now in a nursing home, and when she passes, the family will give the farmer a call very nicely. They almost always give the farmer a call and say, we're going to be selling Ma and Pa's land. Do you want to buy it at a market rate next week before we put it on the market? This sounds like an anecdote. I have seen this exact scenario happen 50 times in the state of Maine, and I'm sure for every time I've heard about it, it happens elsewhere. So it's not just the fact that we have old farmers who need transition. We have, in Maine, it's 100,000 acres of dairy land in Maine that is actively used for agricultural production, which is not in the hands of the farmer. It's probably the same down here. So anyway, I've been going on and on. Let me just talk about where we are right now. You know, we're in a critical point of transition. The economics are changing. I am an optimist by nature. I think that a lot of the factors that are encouraging people to think about local food and the like, actually, just take a step back. You know, I got into this business close to 25 years ago when everyone thought that farming in the Northeast was dead or dying. And one of the critical changes between then and now is there's a hope and an interest and an appreciation and an understanding of farming that average citizens didn't have in the past. And that's absolutely wonderful, and it creates all sorts of opportunity for the future. But we need to build upon that. And it's a critical period of transition because we have these demographic factors that are occurring, but we're also seeing major changes in federal policy, some of which are positive, some of which are not so positive. We're seeing this change in consumer attitudes towards food and what they eat. All of the pieces are there. We don't know where it's going yet, but all the pieces are there for change. But in this critical period of transition that I just mentioned, we can't afford to lose more farmland. If nothing else, that's sort of the first step. Let's just stop the harm, right? That's step number one. We need the land. But it's more than just using the land. If you just protect the land to protect the land, there's value in that. But you also need to make sure you have farmers on that land that they are being economically successful, that you're bringing new people on the land, and you're creating those opportunities. So the only way this is all going to work is if we do all those things simultaneously. And so our critical needs are to protect more farmland, absolutely, but to provide services to keep farmers on the land or get new farmers on the land, and then to provide help so those farmers can thrive. And someone might say, well, why do the farmers need special help? Well, it's because our economic system is broken, to be quite frank about it, and we're not paying the full cost and a whole bunch of services that farmers are providing us, and we're certainly not paying a fair cost for the food that they are growing. And if you don't believe me, I can, in the next session, I'll give you a 5-minute tutorial on milk pricing driven by federal policy in the United States, and you'd be amazed by what I'll tell you, and you'll walk away saying, farmers are getting screwed. So in order to do that, at Maine Farmland Trust and American Farmland Trust, we call efforts to help farmers be successful farm viability. And we view our land protection activities, as important as they are, they've got to go hand in hand with helping those farmers succeed. And then the third leg on the stool, if you will, is this concept of farmland access, helping both existing farmers acquire land when they want to expand, because again, some scaling up might make sense. Existing farmers who are reliant on leased land that is highly vulnerable, helping them get access to that, and then helping these young farmers. And these young farmers are absolutely amazing. You know, some people equate it with the Back to the Land movement of 40 years ago. It's similar in some ways. It's very different in other ways. These are well-educated people, frequently, often not only college graduate, often Ivy League college graduate, who are not trying to escape from the world, but are trying to make a difference in the world. And they are entering into this because they care about community, because they care about the planet, and they're bringing energy, and they're bringing skills, but quite simply, they can't afford the land unless conservation organizations like yours make it affordable. So what does all this mean? The bottom line on this is I honestly think that part of what's needed is just more events like this that just elevate public awareness of farming and where it's at. I'm honestly convinced that this is an easy sell if people just understand more about it. So I applaud Ryan and Stacy and the Conservancy for having a focus on farmland issues, for inviting me here. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's a big piece of it. I honestly think, maybe I'm naive, but I honestly think if we just have more people understand issues about food and farming and these connections, the public support, the public funding, all that will flow. Because it's an easy sell if you understand. And then the companion piece to that is to raise your own awareness. And you're doing that in part today by obviously being here and learning a little bit more. I will offer up one little advertisement when I'm here. I now work for American Farmland Trust, unaffiliated with Maine Farmland Trust. They helped us get started 17 years ago, and we stole a lot of their good ideas, and we stole 2/3 of their name. But otherwise, it's a completely distinct organization. We work nationally, and we work differently in different regions. And I like to describe American Farmland Trust as an organization that is doing that is probably the least known, that is doing some of the most important work in the country. We're only known for one thing, but people don't know it's us behind it. That's this bumper sticker. These are everywhere, and this is American Farmland Trust, but members of my board think that these words should be really small and American Farmland Trust should be really big. I'm not sure that's the answer. But American Farmland Trust is a national organization that works with local land trusts, works on federal policy, does a whole range of demonstration projects around environmentally sound farming practices. And your connection to AFT is another way of you staying involved. So at the risk of pushing you, and yes, do think about, go online, if you want one of these great bumper stickers, go online, 25 bucks, become a member, you'll get a bumper sticker, but more importantly, you can stay connected to these issues that I've identified here. There's a huge opportunity for farming in this region. It depends entirely on people like you, because it depends on consumers and folks who are aware. And to put a point on it, once again, if it's not for conservation organizations creating the opportunity, it's not going to happen in the current economic reality. So here's to your good work, and thank you very much.